Last week I talked about the most comforting albums that I know, and in this video we're now going to talk about the most comforting albums that you know. In case you're unaware of how this works, is that in the previous video, with all the comments that I got, I'm now going to discuss what albums you guys thought were the most comforting in terms of what was recommended the most in the comments by name and or by which comment recommendations had the most upvotes. I gotta admit, which I feel like I say this all the time whenever I do the follow-up video in this series, but one thing I have to admit is, in terms of what was recommended, there was a lot of diversity in terms of the names and albums being brought up. Because usually with other videos, yeah, there's diversity, that there's always, so much I can talk about, but there always seems to be something consistent by name or artist brought up. And with the most comforting albums, I gotta be honest, like half of it was just all different names all the time. Like seriously, in terms of like what you guys found comfort, there was a mixture between like a lot of ambient artists, country artists, folk singers, and quite a handful of metal groups, most particularly in atmospheric black metal. So I just want to state that again, I know I'm going to be talking about the ones that were brought up the most, but there is a lot that I had to gloss over. But once again, I gotta hand it to you guys for always, being so consistent and invested whenever I do another part in this series of the albums that I know. As for the album that was brought up the most, it really goes more to a band that was brought up more than anything else, that being Ulver. And the two albums that you guys kept going back and forth with were the first two of theirs being Bergt and Cavel. Starting with Bergt, their debut full-length album. As most of you guys should know already, this is a Norwegian black metal classic and essential that I feel like, I'm kind of preaching to the choirs, talking about this album. But as you all should know, their approach here was more in vein of like atmospheric black metal that would influence so many bands later on, one of them being even Agalloch. But what made them unique for their time, not only being a part of the Norwegian black metal scene, was, yes, it was atmospheric black metal, but they included a lot of folk instrumentation blended together, that there was a lot more to the composition than just playing fast and sounding raw. And again, their influence on so many other black metal bands, especially in the whole Cascadian black metal scene, would be substantial. But even though this is more of their, funny enough, aggressive album in their discography, if you only look at what they've done from their beginning to end, again, it's still comforting in the sensation of just the simplicity in terms of the themes of admiring nature, the comforting sounds, that nothing really feels like it's lunging at you with this black metal approach. That, again, it's more of a softer execution on atmospheric black metal, and really painted the blueprints for what so many other, again, atmospheric black metal bands would do decades later. As for Cavel, which, probably saying wrong, not really good with pronouncing Norwegian names or words, but with this second album of theirs, they completely abandoned black metal on this album in favor of just a straight up folk instrumentation album with elements of progressive folk and even kind of bleeding into the idea of neo-folk as well. And again, it's just a lot more simplistic. I'm sure for the black metal fans, this is quite the oddball when you look at their early years, but I've noticed that black metal fans also tend to appreciate this album because it still carries the emotion, the themes, and the ideas of Bergt onto this, but just way more simplistic in terms of energy, again, being more of a folk album. That, again, I kind of saw this coming when it came to you guys commenting what you consider to be comforting. It had to be some early Ulver albums, and you guys didn't disappoint. The next three I'm going to be talking about all in this one cohesive description, mainly because, again, I kind of saw all of these coming, and they were all in the style of dream pop, which I feel like if you're trying to get into dream pop, these three groups you need to know by default. That, again, dream pop seems to be more of this lush, dreamy, obviously, comforting and warm sound to pop music that almost by default it's comforting, just its main components. So these were I could see coming a mile away But again, just to save time, as most of you guys who know of Dream Pop, sure, you know of these guys, and if you're trying to get into Dream Pop, you need to check these out and know of them. But that would be Cocteau Twins with their album Treasures, Slowdive with their album Suvaki, and Beach House with their album Devotion. When it comes to talking about Cocteau Twins with their album Treasures, you'll notice on this particular release there's a lot more of like this dark wave influence embedded on how the keyboards are utilized, that even though it's nothing dense or overbearing with how they utilize like these subtle dark wave influences, if anything it's more in the sense like of these light dark undertones on just how the album sounds sonically, that for me what Cocteau Twins tried doing here, and they did it very well, it's a dark album, yes, but it's done in one of the most ethereal ways possible. And again, having the vocalist have her sense of like this gibberish type of singing, I've always felt like whenever she does it, it's done in the sense of like this ignorance is bliss, like you're kind of just like floating away into like this, you know, odyssey kind of journey of just like nothingness and total bliss itself. That, I don't know, just really anything Cocteau Twins does is comforting. It's just with this particular album, Treasures, they do it in a very dark and ethereal way very well. As for Slowdive with their album Suvaki, is that I've always looked at them that yes, they are a shoegaze band, but they've never shied away from utilizing dream pop elements. And with this particular album, what they did essentially was they played all their instrumentations as a shoegaze band, the guitar, bass, drums, how they even sing, and how they utilized the keyboards, yes, was in vein a shoegaze, but they always layered it with dream pop elements to make it all the more lush, warm, vibrant, and just, again, comforting in this very like low energy but lush sound. And when you hear songs in here like When the Sun Hits, 40 Days, and Alcest, it's like, how can you not feel comfort? How can you not feel a little bit of like stress relief from it? It's like you just get engulfed in this like lush, tender atmosphere that I feel like their simplistic approach just made it so influential and inspirational that it's a given for anyone. If you want to get into shoegaze or dream pop, you need to know Slowdive as well. As for the youngest of the three, even though they've been active for nearly 20 years, was Beach House with their album Devotion. Now, Beach House, I would say, of the three is the most simplistic and accessible, mainly because their components for their songwriting is just like indie rock layered over with dream pop elements. That, yeah, what makes it comforting is just how low energy and quiet it kind of comes off like. That basically you listen to it and you just kind of like meld with the music itself and you just drift off with it, that it's just really kind of like a chill out album. And even though it's, you know, simplistic and accessible, and I know on like internet culture, basically anything that's accessible, easy to get into, a gateway for any kind of like genre is considered bad because that's easy, and we want something more obscure and just harder to get into because for some reason it makes us feel all special on the internet. I get that because I was guilty of that, and to an extent I still kind of am. But I do feel like when it comes to gateway groups, artists, or bands for any genre, metal included, they are important because to get someone into a style of music that they're unfamiliar with is a challenge. And with Beach House, they're doing that for people. And I feel like, again, if you want to get into dream pop, you want to understand just the layering of it, the songwriting, the textures, and what it can give off musically, and just the emotional aspect of it with comfort, yeah, I would recommend Beach House just solely because they are accessible and easy to get into for an understanding of dream pop. Alcest, Achilles de Lune, another album I saw coming a mile away in the comments, mainly because with Alcest's approach with black metal is that they've always had more of like this surreal and serene type of like vibe with it. Because what they tend to do is they'll have one foot in black metal influence, but the other foot is like in the influence of that of like post-rock, shoegaze, and post-metal. Hence why they're always labeled to be like a post-black metal band or a black gaze metal band, which is again a mixture of black metal and shoegaze. That I know for a lot of die-hard purists in black metal, they kind of like really discredit Alcest for this approach. But make no mistake about it, whether you consider it to be a true black metal band or this kind of like hybrid of black metal and other forms of music, it is comforting, mainly because of just how dreamlike it sounds. And that all has to do with the fact that I believe the concept with this album is it has to do with Neij's dreams that he had as a child and like this dreamland of his. And this is all just kind of like a conceptual piece describing the dreams that he had. And the music is a really great representation of like that serene and surreal setting that he's trying to create here. Even when it gets to the more extreme parts on this album with the harsh vocals or faster instrumentation with the guitars and drums, it never feels urgent or overly aggressive. If anything, it feels a bit more explorative in the musical sense to create this kind of like dreamlike surrealist state of mind with the setting, that when you pay attention to the guitar riffs and melodies, yeah, it has the power and distortion of black metal, but it's structured in the sense of shoegaze. Hence why I feel like a lot of metal fans will find this particular album comforting for a black metal album. You'll get the energy of black metal, but the soft, emotive compassion of shoegaze. Nick Drake, Pink Moon. This album was actually brought up to me before in the video, the most depressing albums that I know, but it was overshadowed by other albums that just got more comments and more upvotes. But what makes this album depressing is I believe it was released in 1972, and Nick Drake passed away, in 1974, so it's only like 2 years apart from his death, sadly, as he overdosed of drug addiction from antidepressants, sadly enough. And what makes it depressing is, again, Nick Drake is being more vulnerable with his emotions, dealing with all these negative emotions and depression, obviously. But what makes it comforting, I guess, in some sense, is that even though it's only, 28 minutes long, it's a pretty short album, it feels like it's 28 minutes of an individual lending his shoulder for you to cry on. Emotionally speaking, when talking about this album, is that yes, it's layered a lot with themes to do with dealing with depression, which is obviously a very powerful negative emotion. And what makes it comforting is when you hear Nick Drake singing about it, you have more of this bond attachment with him, in the sense now that you're listening to someone who understands what it's like to be depressed, what it's like to feel with these negative emotions and live with them. Thus you get comfort just in the sense of having someone understanding you, I guess, that you don't feel so alone in this world. So yeah, again, it's a depressing album in some parts. It also just feels comforting of just how sweet and tender it's trying to be, with just this understanding, kind of therapeutic, emotive sense, I guess. And even though it's done in the sense of folk music with how the guitar and Nick Drake is singing, it's a very beautiful album as well. That, again, I feel like for anyone who's just looking for comforting music, as obvious as it is I know this album is very celebrated in the sense of 70s folk music, definitely listen to this. Katara, with their latest full-length album from 2021. I can't pronounce it because it's either in Indonesian or Somalian, and I don't want to butcher that language. But totally forgot about this project until you guys talked about it in the comments in the previous video. Because I remember people were hyping this dude up about a handful of years ago, because it's a very unique approach to black metal that I really can't compare it to really anyone besides maybe Panopticon. Because what it is that even though it's labeled to be a black metal band because it's signed to a black metal label, it's even in the metal archives, it's not really black metal at all, because all the instrumentation that you'll hear from really any album is way more rooted in folk music, mainly because what you're hearing is all done by acoustic instrumentation. Just like with Panopticon's Kentucky, I know a lot of people consider it to be a black metal album with a lot of folk instrumentation, but to me, honestly, what this album is that, yeah, it has the power and energy of black metal, but it's way more rooted in bluegrass and folk instrumentation throughout it. And I feel like what Kaatayra does is it takes that formula, but it applies it to Latin American folk music. Now, apologies if I come off like this black metal purist, but with the latest full-length album, it's weird for me to call it black metal, mainly because there's nothing really black metal at all about it other than like the distortion on the production that kind of gives off like atmospheric black metal vibes, but that's really it. Even the vocals on here are clean. There are no harsh vocals at all, really. That if you want Kaatayra to have more of like the acoustic playing with harsh vocals really reminiscent to that of black metal, listen to this album, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce because I'll butcher that so hard, but again, a really unique approach to black metal. But with the latest full-length album, yeah, there's a lot of atmosphere in terms of the production. In terms of how upbeat it has more of like this punk kind of influence with it. And the clean singing is not really all that aggressive that you would expect in a metal album. Again, it kind of just like glides through everything. And again, as I stated, it's really all just acoustic instruments being played. Thus, everything just kind of feels more comforting on the ears. That I would say if you are an extreme metal fan, but you want acoustic instrumentation to be played to that, you know, tempo and vibe, this might appeal to you in a very unorthodox and avant-garde way. Bjork, Vespertine, which is another artist that was brought up numerous times, but it was from all different albums that she's done. And to be fair, you can listen to anything in her discography and find some form of comfort with it, especially when you notice with all the genres she usually plays around with, that she's very ambitious with a lot of experimentation with electronic music, trip hop, and a lot of pop influence. Yet Vespertine, I've noticed, is probably the most ambient driven, at least on the instrumental side of things, because it's in the sense that it's just trying to create as much atmosphere as possible, just engulf the listener from head to toe. I feel like that, yeah, as I stated, you could listen to anything she's done and find comfort with it, just solely because Bjork's vocals have always been just so like light-hearted and warm and welcoming. But Vespertine is comforting in the sense of the instrumental parts of it, as I stated. And if you want Bjork, I would say at the most ambient driven, listen to this album. Katatonia, Tonight's Decision. So these guys were a very well-respected death doom band, but over the years have progressed more into the styles of depressive rock and progressive metal, and they still are respected to this day. And what I've noticed with the album Tonight's Decision is that there's a lot of elements of goth rock kind of like scattered throughout it. Thus you get like this sensation of like melancholy, and it's a lot more moody with the emotional aspect. And I guess what people find comforting about it is in terms of the compositions, it's like done in the sense that it's very dark but beautiful at the same time. Really similar to that of what I stated with talking about Nick Drake's album Pink Moon a few minutes ago. I feel like this is that approach, only the metal version of it, where you get comfort in the sense of you have a band who is expressing these negative and depressive emotions and themes here, but it's in a relatable sense, thus you kind of like have a bond with it. Catatonia does that as well, very well, and Tonight's Decision is a great representation of that. Again, if you're looking for more of the comforting, dark, and melancholic approaches with metal. And the final album for this video will be Druth with their second full-length, Autumn Aurora. So one thing I've always noticed about Druth is it's kind of like the Slavic version of Burzum, as it's very atmospheric and has a lot of ambience utilized throughout it. However, musically what makes Druth kind of special and one of like the heavy hitters in Ukrainian black metal is, I would say, out of really any black metal I know, Druth is easily the most poetic, not just lyrically, but also musically. Because lyrically, yes, they take a lot of influence from historical Ukrainian poets, but the music is kind of like this representation of that, and they do it with black metal. Because when you pay attention to the compositions here, yeah, there's like this classical kind of influence of how everything's structured together, thus it makes it feel very thought out. And the transitions between black metal to the acoustic parts gives off more of like this euphoric effect with it, thus you really kind of get lost with the music that it's playing. As ultra cliche as this is to say, it's one of those albums that I feel like you're supposed to listen to when you just kind of like walk through a forest on like a really warm and soothing autumn day is what this album kind of feels like as you listen to it. And even though it runs for roughly around 48 minutes long, nothing feels like filler, and it almost feels like you want this to be like this never-ending journey through that forest. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, everything I talked about will be linked below in the description. Really curious to know, again, what are albums that you find comforting, even if you're just kind of repeating yourself because I didn't talk about an album from the previous video. Let me know again and I'll definitely check it out later on. And yeah, other than that, like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated and have a great day.